Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more ideas and opinions of Albert Einstein. Today we will be reading four pieces, and we will start off with America and the Disarmament Conference of 1932, which appeared in Mein Bild Amsterdam, Querido Verlag, 1934. The Americans of today are filled with the care the cares arising out of the economic conditions in their own country. The efforts of their responsible leaders are directed primarily to remedying the serious unemployment at home. The sense of being involved in the destiny of the rest of the world, and in particular of the mother country of Europe, is even less strong than in normal times. But the free play of economic forces will not by itself automatically overcome these difficulties. Regulative measures by the community are needed to bring about a sound distribution of labor and consumers' goods among mankind. Without this, even the people of the richest countries suffocate. The fact is that since the amount of work needed to supply everybody's needs has been reduced through the improvement of technical methods, the free play of economic forces no longer produces a state of affairs in which all the available labor can find employment. Deliberate regulation and organization are becoming necessary to make the results of technical progress beneficial to all. If the economic situation cannot be cleared up without systemic regulation, how much more necessary is such regulation for dealing with the international problems politics? Few of us still cling to the notion that the acts of violence in the shape of wars are either advantageous or worthy of humanity as a method of involving international problems. But we are not consistent enough to make vigorous efforts on behalf of the measures which might prevent war, that savage and unworthy relic of the age of barbarism. It requires some power of reflection to see the issue clearly, and a certain courage to serve this great cause resolutely and effectively. Anybody who really wants to abolish war must resolutely declare himself in favor of his own country's resigning a portion of its sovereignty in favor of international institutions. He must be ready to make his own country amenable in case of a dispute to the award of an international court. He must, in the most uncompromising fashion, support disarmament all around, as it is actually envisaged in the unfortunate Treaty of Versailles. Unless military and aggressively patriotic education is abolished, we can hope for no progress. No event in the last few years reflects such disgrace on the leading civilized countries of the world as the failure of all disarmament conferences so far. For this failure is due not only to the intrigues of ambitious and unscrupulous politicians, but also to the indifference and slackness of the public in all countries. Unless this is changed, we shall destroy the really valuable achievements of our predecessors. I believe that the American people are only perfectly aware of the responsibility which rests with them in this matter. They no doubt think, let Europe go to the dogs if she is destroyed by the quarrelsomeness and wickedness of her inhabitants. The good seed of our Wilson has produced a mighty poor crop in the stony group of Europe. We are strong and safe and in no hurry to mix ourselves up in other people's affairs. Such an attitude is neither noble nor far-sighted. America is partly to blame for the difficulties of Europe. By ruthlessly pressing her claims, she is hastening the economic and therewith the moral decline of Europe. She has helped to balkanize Europe and therefore shares the responsibility for the breakdown of political morality and the growth of that spirit of revenge which feeds on despair. This spirit will not stop short of the gates of America. I had almost said, has not stopped short. Look around and beware. The truth can be briefly stated. The Disarmament Conference comes as a final chance to you no less than to us of preserving the best that civilized humanity has produced. And it is on you, as the strongest and comparatively soundest among us, that the eyes and hopes of the world of all are focused. Now, you have to remember that the U.S. during World War I spent most of the war selling goods to both sides and thus making money as the two sides fought amongst each other. And it wasn't until the final year, I think it was late in 1917, that we actually joined the war, which ended in 1918. So we didn't suffer near as much as the rest of Europe did. And thus we see Albert Einstein saying, it is partially America's fault as well. And so she needs to help sign this disarmament conference because, we need to make sure that the growing tensions in Europe do not explode. And they're talking about 1932's Disarmament Conference. And of course, we know 1941, World War II. So only 9 years later, which Hitler would just start gathering power around 33 in Germany. So things started to switch. But yeah. Next piece I'm going to read is called The Question of Disarmament. It appeared in Mein Weltbild, Amsterdam Querido Verlag, 1934. The greatest obstacle to the success of the disarmament plan was the fact that the people in general le- left out of account the chief difficulties of the problem. Most objects are gained by gradual um, steps. For example, the supersession of absolute monarchy by democracy. Here, however, we are concerned with the objective which cannot be reached step by step. As long as the possibility of war remains, nations will insist on being as perfectly prepared in a military sense as they can, in order to emerge triumphant from the next war. It will also be impossible to avoid educating the youth in warlike traditions and cultivating narrow national vanity joined in the glorification of the warlike spirit, as long as people have to be prepared for occasions when such a spirit will be needed for the purpose of war. To arm is to give one's voice and make one's preparations not for peace, but for war. Therefore, people will not disarm step by step. They will disarm at one blow or not at all. The accomplishment of such a far reaching change in the life of nations presupposes a mighty moral effort, a deliberate departure from deeply ingrained tradition. Anyone who is not prepared to make the fate of his country in case of a dispute depend entirely on the decisions of an international court of arbitration, and to enter into a treaty to this effort without reserve is not really resolved to avoid war. It is the case of all or nothing. It is undeniable that previous attempts to ensure peace have failed through aiming at inadequate compromises. Disarmament and security are only to be had in combination. The one guarantee of security is an undertaking by all nations to give effort to the decisions of the international authority. We stand, therefore, at the parting of the ways, whether we find the way of peace or continue along the old road of brute force, so unworthy of our civilization, depends on ourselves. One on the one side, the freedom of the individual and the security of society beckon to us. On the other, slavery for the individual and the annihilation of our civilization threaten us. Our fate will be according to our deserts. So, again, Einstein still trying to push for disarmament. And you have to remember, this is even before the creation of the nuclear bomb. We're just focused on the numbers of deaths of World War One and the use of chemical and gas chemical weapons and gases. So, next piece we're going to read is called Arbitration, and it was published in Mein Weltbild, Amsterdam, Querido Verlag, 1934. Systematic disarmament within a short period is only possible in combination with a guarantee of all nations for the security of each individual one, based on a permanent court of arbitration independent of governments. Unconditional obligation of all countries not merely to accept the decisions of the court of arbitration, but also to carry them out. Separate courts of arbitration for Europe with Africa, America, and Asia. Australia to be apportioned to one of these. A joint court of arbitration for questions involving issues that cannot be settled within the limits of any one of these regions. So here Einstein's really suggesting we need a way to look forward to disarmament. You know, even if we have to have a level of arbitration, which he wants all the countries of the world to feel like they have to respond to, but yeah, it don't always go that way. But the last piece I'm going to read is called To Sigmund Freud, and it was a private letter written around 1931 or the beginning of 1932, and it's published in Mein Weltbild, Querido Verlag, 1934. Dear Professor Freud, it is admirable how the yearning to perceive the truth has overcome every other yearning in you. You have shown with impelling lucidity how inseparably the combative and destructive instincts are bound up in the human psyche with those of love and life. But at the same time, there shines through the cogent logic of your arguments a deep longing for the great goal of internal and external liberation of mankind from war. This great aim has been professed by all those who have been venerated as moral and spiritual leaders beyond the limits of their own time and country without exception, from Jesus Christ to Goethe to Kant. It is not significant that such men have been universally accepted as leaders, even though their efforts to mold the course of human affairs were attended with but small success. I am convinced that the great men, those whose achievements in howsoever is restricted a sphere set them above their fellows, share to an overwhelming extent the same idea, but they have little influence on the course of political events. It almost looks as if this domain on which the fate of nations depends has inescapably to be given over to the violence and irresponsibility of political rulers. Political leaders and governments owe their position partly to force and partly to popular election. They cannot be regarded as representative of the best elements, morally or intellectually, in their respective nations. The intellectual elite have no direct influence on the history of nations in these days. Their lack of cohesion prevents them from taking a direct part in the solution of contemporary problems. Don't you think that a change might be brought about in this respect by a free association of people whose previous achievements and actions constitute a guarantee of their ability and purity of aim? This association of an international nature whose members would need to keep in touch with each other by a constant interchange of opinions might, by defining its attitude in the press, responsibility always resting with the signatories of any given occasion, acquire a considerable and salutary moral influence over the settlement of political questions. Such an association would, of course, be a prey to all the ills which so often lead to the degeneration of learned societies, dangers which are inseparably bound up in the imperfections of human nature. But should not an effort in this direction be risked in spite of this? I have, or I look upon such an attempt as nothing less than an imperative duty. As an intellectual association of standing, such as I have described, could be formed, it would also have to make a consistent scribed or it would also have to make a consistent effort to mobilize the religious organization for the fight against war. It would give countenance to many whose good intentions are paralyzed today by melancholy resignation. Finally, I believe that an association formed of persons such as I have described, each highly esteemed in his own line, would be well suited to give valuable moral support to those elements in the League of Nations which are really working toward the great objective for which that institution exists. I had rather put those proposals to you than to anyone else in the world, because you, least of all men, are the dupe of your desires, and because your critical judgment is supported by a most grave sense of responsibility. So, yeah, Einstein asking Sigmund Freud for his thoughts on an intellectual organization that internationally to help bring about peace and other things if they need to help guide the League of Nations. But yeah, that'll be it. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.